Having gone through our colors example and changing a lot of the code over to be a more functional style definitely gave me some other ideas of places where we could potentially have some code savings by reusing code that we're not currently doing. I really like all the functions that we threw in, but there were a few places in here where it seemed like maybe just using a plain old require might actually allow us to do some interesting things with the code that maybe would be a little too cumbersome to do with functions themselves. One of those places, certainly the simplest of them, is over on my new page. On my new page, I did a bit of work here to actually rework the new form and the way it actually is functioning. What I did was I removed the loop that had previously been running off an array that was building all of my text fields for me in favor of this new text field function that we created previously. I like this way a whole lot better, but right now over on my edit page, I'm still doing it the same way I was doing it previously with the loop. Well, instead of going through and actually changing the edit page to do it the way that the new page is doing it, I thought, well, aren't the fields on both of those two forms identical? There's really no difference between them, so why should they be repeated? So what I'm going to do instead of updating my edit page to use my text field function is I'm instead going to take all of those calls to my text field function that I'm doing on the new page, I'm going to cut them out, and I'm going to drop them into a brand new file. I'm going to save this brand new file as underscore form.php, so that's my new file's name. Since the code I want to execute here in this file is PHP code, let me put in some PHP tags for it and drop that code in there. And at that point, I should have a reusable form that I can use on both the new and the edit page. So back on the new page again, in the same PHP tags where I just copied all those text field function calls from, let me put in a require for my new form file instead. The actual name of the file I gave it is underscore form.php. I did the underscore because in my mind that means it's a partial page. I could take that exact same line then, that require, and I could put that in place of what I currently have inside my edit form. So in my edit form, which is right now, to be honest, kind of a bit of a mess from the looks of it, how about I instead just put in that require, and I'll just get rid of all the rest of this stuff. So as far as the forms on my two pages go, what I'm actually left with is they both have their own individual form tags. Since they submit to different places, I figured I would leave them as they are in each of those two files. I still have a submit button in each one of them. Again, those are different. On the new page it says create, and on the edit page the submit button says update. But the actual fields that go into the form are the same on both pages, so now those fields are simply being provided here with a require to a partial file, this file here. Let's see how that looks. Here I am on my index page. If I jump over to the new page, nothing seems to have changed. Validation still functions just fine. If I make a color, it looks like it works just dandy. If I go over to my edit page now, if I remove a value, it looks like validation is working just fine. So really not a whole lot of difference from sort of a user's point of view, but from a code point of view, anytime I now need to make an update to my form, I can do it simply by modifying that one file, just by modifying my underscore form.php file. All right, that's pretty fantastic. What else could I potentially do? Well, I don't know for sure, but I think the next step I want to take is a place where I might differ some from a lot of people. What a lot of people I see do in PHP when they start looking at being able to sort of reuse and templatize their pages is they'll start taking bytes out of the pages and putting those off as separate files. For example, this main section that I have here, I have it essentially at the top of every one of my pages, and they're all pretty much the same. There's a chance that they might need to be different from page to page, but that's certainly not something that's happening right now. Right now, they're definitely all the same. So a lot of people might want to take that and stick that off into a partial file and then just require it on each individual page. And that's fine. I've certainly done things that way, but the thing that bothers me about it is that now, even though that code has been moved off to a separate file, it's now being required in 5 different files. So if I ever wanted to change something not about the content of the header itself, but about the way it's being required, I would still have to go change it in 5 different places. Kind of the way I like to think about it, or the way I find myself thinking about it, is that when I look at the different pages that make up this project and similar projects to it, I don't see that there's just little chunks that can be taken out like that header section, but I see that the majority of every page is actually the same. Every page has its own little custom block of PHP up at the top that kicks off the work of the page, but then every page has a doc type, every page has a head section, every page is linking to the same style sheets. Every page has a body. That body then does have that header in it, but that header is just such a little part of everything that's actually going on. Really, when I look at these pages, what I see is that the only parts of these pages that are really unique, that are really special, are the PHP blocks up at the top, and generally the part that's appearing inside the body, inside this div that I've put in there called content. So each page has its own custom PHP processing, and each page shows its own custom content, but all of those things happen inside this greater framework of a page, where the overall page is basically identical from one to the next. If I look here at my index page, I see all the same sort of thing that I see if I jump over to my show color page. It's all basically the same thing, very, very close to it. So what I might like to do here, as a way of sort of templatizing these pages and potentially making it easier on myself to be able to manage the pages overall, is I would want to see if I could find a way where I could pull out not just little bytes of the file, but virtually the entire HTML structure of the file itself. What my idea is, and maybe I should just start working through it here so you can see. Let me start here with my index page. On my index page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything in this page other than the PHP at the top, and I'm going to cut it out. So my index page for the moment becomes just this, just the PHP code itself. Well, this page still needs the HTML structure. Yes, most definitely it certainly does. But what I'm thinking is, what if I provide that HTML structure to the index PHP page through a couple of different templates that I could require? I'm going to start a new file. I'm going to paste in everything that I cut out of my index page into that new file. And then I'm going to do almost the same thing again. I'm going to come back to this page. I'm going to take all of the custom content just for the index page. I'm going to cut that out, drop that into a new file. So essentially I've taken what was one page and I've split it up into three. The three different files that I've split it up into, basically I have the PHP code from the top of my index page. I now have a page that has in it nothing but sort of the generic HTML structure of my page. And I have a third page which is nothing but the actual content of the index page itself, just what's typically shown in the body, basically the table with the colors in it. My main PHP for the index page is still called index.php. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to take the page that is just the structure of my overall page and I'm going to save that. When I save it, I'm going to save it as _template.php. And then the page that is actually the content of the index page itself, I'm going to save that one as index.view.php. All right. The trick then becomes, now that I've separated what's in my mind, sort of the three different components that go into making up each one of my pages, is finding a way to tie them all back together again. What I hope to achieve by going about this is basically minimizing the duplication from one page to another. If each page is itself nothing but its own custom PHP code, and it can then automatically fill in the basic template structure of the page, and then fill that template structure with just the custom content for that individual page, I think that'll go a long way to minimizing the actual duplication from file to file. So here's the way I'm going to go about it. What I'm going to do is, in the index page itself, the actual PHP page, I'm going to put a require in at the bottom of it. And what I'm going to require at the bottom is simply that template file, template.php. What I want to do in the template file then is I want to put the logic into that file where it will look at the page that's using it, in this case index.php, and based on the page that's using the template will then go find a corresponding similarly named page, index.view.php, and automatically fill it in. Let's just look at how things are here with just this require for template.php. If I jump over to the browser and hit refresh, my index page now essentially shows up kind of like a blank page. The basics of it are there. That's because my index page here, index.php, when I make a request for it and it executes, it goes through the general process of reading the colors from the file, and then it requires the template. The template right now is essentially nothing but my CSS and an empty HTML structure. What I want is I now want this part to fill in the content section, the content part of the body, with the content of index.view.php. The The way I want to get it to do that is I want it to make an association between the file names. If the page using the template is index.php, then it seems like I should be able to programmatically get it to convert that name to index.view.php instead. Here's how I'm thinking I can go about that. Down in this content section, I'm going to throw in a PHP block. Let me scoot that up a little bit so we can see it better. Inside this PHP block, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make some extensive use of a variable. This variable is one I don't believe we've talked about before. It's a variable in a server array. It's essentially a variable that's put together for us automatically by the PHP server, and the actual variable's key in that array is PHP self. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to echo that so we can see what's in it. If I jump over to my browser now, refresh, that's what I'm actually showing up with inside that variable. It's essentially a path on the server and the name of the file that's being accessed. So I requested the path and file name /reuse/colors/index.php, and that's exactly what's in that particular variable. And what I can do with that variable is that PHP has another function available to me called basename. If I call the basename function and pass it that value, what that does is it trims off the path. It essentially leaves me with just the file name itself. So now, if I request index.php, that variable passed to that function gives me back index.php. So essentially that is a way that a page can know what its own name is. One of several different ways, but it's one that works pretty cleanly most of the time. If I were doing the same thing over on my show page, show.php would show up. If I was doing this on my new page, new.php would show up. So now that I've got that narrowed down and I have the page where it actually knows what its own name is, I could then have it just splice in the word .view there in the middle. So here, instead of echoing that value, what if I save it in a variable? I'll just put it in a variable called name. It's the page's name. As a matter of fact, maybe it'd be a little more clear if I actually said page name. I could then explode that page name. And when I explode it, I'm going to explode it on a period so that I can separate the name of the page from the extension. So I'll explode the page name variable. That will end up giving me back an array. I'll call it page name parts. And then if I were to echo page name parts element 0, that should be just the name of the file with no extension at all. Let's take a look in the browser and see if that's what I get. Yes, indeed, the index page comes back with just index. If I were to then take that same thing and I were to append .view.php on the end of it, then what I have at that point is I have the name of the file that I want to fill in to the content of this particular page. So the idea is I requested index.php. Index.php required my page template. My page template then saw that index.php is what required it, constructs this file name, and then fills itself with the content from that file. So let's give that a try for real. What I'm going to do here is instead of echoing that value, what if I change that into a require? So we actually require a file by that name. Let's see what happens on my index page. Wow, would you look at that? My index page is back to looking exactly the same way it did before. Except now, my index page itself is actually being constructed from 3 separate parts. The index page itself is really, at this point, physically, nothing but these 3 lines of code. That's all it actually is. The last of those lines of code, though, is the requiring of my template, saying I want to use this template. The template itself then gives me the basic structure of my overall HTML page, and it then, based on the fact that it's being used by index.php, figures out that it needs to fill the content section with index.view.php. Index.view.php then is the actual content that I want to be displayed on my index page. I think this is an interesting way of setting things up because it's going to give me quite a bit of different flexibility. Some of the flexibility it's going to give me is that if I wanted to change something in my header, all I have to do is change it in my template. If I wanted to change the overall structure of the file, maybe I didn't want to do HTML5 anymore, I wanted to go back to XHTML, all I would have to do is change that in my template. If I wanted to add a footer that appeared on every page below my content, you guessed it, just change it in the template. That would be it. Now that's okay. We could have achieved something very much like that just using sort of regular requires, not this Russian doll system that I've put together here. But I think there's some other potential advantages that I could get from having it set up this way. What if, for example, I didn't always want an HTML page to be generated? I could potentially add some code over to my index page or maybe to the template itself that instead of requesting HTML code, requested something else altogether. Maybe I could have my page return JSON data or XML data. Since the index page itself, the part that is actually handling the request and the retrieval of the data from disk, since it is no longer specifically tied to HTML, it's reasonable that at this point I could come up with a system so that any kind of data could potentially be returned. Keep in mind that a lot of times the web nowadays isn't about HTML at all. It's about APIs, basically setting up systems where requests can be made using the internet or the web as the communication medium, but then having different types of data returned other than just HTML. HTML is one of our possibilities, but it's certainly not the only one. Let's see about making this same change in some other places. How about if I jump over to my show page? Let's see if I can do essentially the same thing. What I'm going to do on my show page is I'm going to take just the content out of the body, just the content itself. I'm going to cut that out, paste that into a new page. I think I might have gotten an extra div there. I'm going to go ahead and save that then as show.view.php. Now, with the content of the show page separated from the structure of the show page itself, in the actual show page itself, I'll just wipe out the rest of that generic page structure, and instead down at the bottom of the page, I'll require my template. The thinking should be that then when I request my show page, the show page will do all of its normal work, finding the color that's supposed to be displayed. It'll then require the template. The template will see that it's the show page that has been requested, so it should look for a file called show.view.php to fill in the content. Let's see if it works. If I click on one of my colors, my show page seems to work exactly the same way it did before. Everything seems like it's working real well. I can go through and I can make these exact same changes for my new page, for my edit page. The only page I'm really not going to need to make much of a change to is my destroy page, because the destroy page itself doesn't have any HTML component that goes along with it. It's always been nothing but pure PHP, so there's really no need for using the template on that page. But for my new page and my edit page, I can make essentially the exact same changes that I've now made to index and show, and I'll have a nice templatized setup for this website, making it easy for me to update and giving me a lot of different possible flexibilities, a lot of different things I might be able to do with it concerning formats of data that it returns as I make other changes to it in the future.